So there is this idea in Ashes of Creation's development that there is going to be this procedurally generated content. And I want to talk about what procedurally generated means. Is something that is generated algorithmically as opposed to manually curated. And so you have something like a procedurally generated tree system, and every tree looks a little bit unique. And there is this idea that every server on Ashes of Creation is going to be in this truly unique and ephemeral place because the seasons can be out of alignment and the nodes can be out of alignment. And that is going to cause everybody's experience to be different. So let's talk about what's happening here. So every world in Ashes of Creation is going to be identical. Every server will be identical. And there is this idea that it's going to create a large number of unique experiences. Now, within the Ashes of Creation world, there are going to be what's called zones of influence. Now, these zones of influence are effectively just subdivided zones on a map, not unlike an existing MMO labels things for the purpose of navigation. So when you go into something like Final Fantasy XIV, you go to Dravania, the Churning Mists, and within the Churning Mists, you have Oltan, Landlord Colony, Four Arms, Greensward, and so on. And this is important because when we have a quest tell us to go somewhere, we can see it's going to tell me to go to East Shroud, the big zone, and Lark's Call, the small zone. But that's largely all we use it for is navigation. And there's some lore references to it, but that's it. It doesn't do anything magical. It just is a place. But they're going to take it a little bit further than that. They're going to take it a lot further than that. They're going to take it into where there is this ownership. Now, ownership of a sub-portion of a map is very close to New World. So here is the New World map, and it has ownership. And so you can see the various factions within the game owning it, and it changes the color of that zone to who owns it. Okay? And so I think this element of it probably will have a lot of overlap, and people that like this element of New World will probably enjoy being able to own zones. These zones have mayors, they set tax rates, that affects travel, and they've had to try to solve what ownership means within server merges, which Ashes of Creation will have to do as well. They talk about it kind of like a seasonal reset. So we have these nodes, and total, there are going to be what we believe to be 111 nodes. So they've got this little simulation. This is on their official website, so I'm not pulling anything out of thin air. I'm pulling it from their resources and things I've heard Steven talk about and people who cover the game talk about, but they're letting time tick at an accelerated rate, and they're showing the zones kind of change in ownership. Now, as they change in ownership, they're going to have a chance to mature. And so you're seeing these nodes kind of grow and rise and fall. And as they do, they go through these different development stages. And so within Ashes of Creation node system, there's going to be a node progression. Okay? And so there will be different node types, and each node might have a unique specialization, which will determine the types of NPCs it can have, the type of focus that it has. And then layered on top of that, we're going to have 4 seasons. The seasons in the game are going to change what sort of events can be up, what sort of enemies can spawn. So there will be 4 varieties of each node, and each node will have the ability to be progressed through each of its 7 stages, beginning at Wilderness and working its all the way up to Metropolis. And so if we look at 111 nodes, we would do these 7 times 7 times 7 times 7 times 7 up to the power of 111, and we would end up with effectively a much larger map than this, with a wide variety of what could be going on within each one, kind of. Because there's a cap, there's only 5 metropolises, so it's not really 7, not all zones could be in a metropolis state at the same time. It doesn't seem like statistically you would ever end up where like all 111 were at Wilderness, so you're always going to have some mix and match. And so this starts to get a lot closer to what Guild Wars 2 does in a PvP mode, a PvP exclusive zone called World v World. And so World v World is something where they pit whole servers against whole servers on maps. And so you have these maps here, and all of these maps have nodes in them. Now those nodes cannot progress. A castle is a castle, a town is a town, and so these nodes exist across, you know, everything from basically an expedition to a metropolis, but what it is they're predetermined. And so there's big nodes and there's little nodes. And there's ownership across the three factions, and the factions are made up of servers that fight against each other in this seasonal type conflict, and there's multiple maps going on at the same time. And so you have this sort of thing where this kind of exists. And this is already where you start to see, how will this actually feel? And the answer is, it's mostly fun, but ultimately a handful of players that really sit down and learn the rules to this system. It is not true RNG, it's what's called a state machine. Because it is predetermined. Kind of. Because true RNG might have bounds, right? If you have an RNG simulator that talks about like a D6 dice, it is RNG, but it's bound within those 6 outcomes. So we've already bound it, but there's a lot going on simultaneously. So in one particular node's lifespan, we're going to have this kind of player-owned action going on within one particular node. So let's just talk about what one node can be. So one node is owned by a player, and it is currently, it's already predetermined to have its specialization. So we're not learning anything there. That's just variety from one node to the next, but that one node already has its specialization. But that node can already exist as a lovely little wilderness, right, with these lovely little trees. It could also exist as a little expedition, which is where it's still mostly trees, right? But there's a little tent, and we're moving along. It could also be progressed up to being an encampment, where now we have 2 tents and maybe a little campfire, right? And so we've got our lovely little tents. It's gonna be intense. I hope you're ready. Now we could from there move to a little village. Now this will all be done through player progressed actions. So it doesn't seem like the game is going to progress this on their own. If nobody logged on, it seems like we would have a problem, because this would just die. So this game is heavily dependent on a minimum number of players. So it is not like Path of Exiles, where the devs have come out and said, we designed the game to still be functional even if the player population drops critically low. This does seem like there is a minimum number of players per server that has to be there, which starts to bring up a lot of questions about how server merges will work. They've started to work their way through that. The game is not released yet, so anything could change. Everything is not fleshed out. But it does mean server merges are going to be important, because there is a minimum number of players for a world to feel alive, as opposed to something like Final Fantasy XIV, where for the MSQ experience, as they go back and add AI, there's actually been a complaint by the community that you could kind of do whatever you want. You can play through the majority of the new player experience in Final Fantasy XIV and avoid being around a lot of other players. And so there's question is, if I don't have to play with other players, is it still an MMO? There's this frustration there. This is definitely an MMO. This is definitely an MMO, because without the world feeling that it can progress through these stages, you're going to be leaving an enormous amount of the features they have outlined thus far off the table. For the world to truly show off everything the devs have done, we need to have a variety of these stages, and they don't seem to be something where the AI is going to push it along. It seems to be entirely player-driven. So we've got our first 4. Now from there we could move up to a little town. And so now we've got not just little houses, not just beautiful little houses, but maybe we've got like a big town hall of some sort. Right? So we're starting to progress, and we're going to have the ability, once we get to this point, for players to own these small houses. I don't know what that means when it reduces back down. Do you lose ownership? Do you get a refund? We'll have to see what that does. What's the value in investing? This starts to mimic something very similar to, let's say, something like EVE Online. And so EVE Online has a map that is divided into really two types of space. Two types of space. And those two types of space are this middle area, which is called secured space. This is guaranteed new player experience. This is what World of Warcraft calls Exile's Reach. These are protected areas designed for people that don't want to be around other players, and they're just getting to know the game. And it guarantees that at any given time, you can safely learn the game, and you can safely get rewards, but it's kind of capping those rewards. You can't really truly experience EVE Online and fully live your entire lifespan within secured space. It's just not everything that EVE Online offers. And so you have this high security, and if you attack somebody within high secured space, there is a response time from an NPC police force that will come in and wreck their faces. Now, as we drop out of secured space and we lower the amount of security that is around, we eventually move into what is called nullsec. Zero security. No security provided. And that is all these colors out here. And that means that that space can be claimed by players. Now in nullsec, players can build space stations. They can have ships that are so large that when they log out, those ships are not allowed to despawn. The game really gets a chance to shine out here. And there is all sorts of fancier resources to be gained from nullsec. And so this security, this lack of security out here, allows the game to be truly free-flowing and truly sandbox. And what we have learned is that players can abuse the living daylights out of this. But that's the beauty of EVE. EVE is a beautiful and stunning spreadsheet simulator, and what is exciting about EVE is the stories that come out of espionage, and out of backstabbing, and out of alliances. And so EVE is in those moments that took sometimes weeks or months to get to, where a few players or hundreds of players have this drastic impact on other players. And this is perpetually on PvP. But you're not, if you are part of Goonswarm and you're out doing some gathering way in the center of Goonswarm space, the odds of you being attacked is very slim. You're shockingly safe. You might be, but if you are, don't worry. Goonswarm's going to come and protect you. There will be penalties for that. They will absolutely hunt down whoever destroyed you, and in some cases, they will negotiate with the leaders of that faction to pay you for your ship back, pay you for whatever you lost. And so there is not an infinite number of possibilities within each node, but the experience can vary wildly based on the time and where you are on the map, and the act of traveling, the act of going from Solar Fleet to Goonswarm Federation takes time. And so there is a risk versus reward mentality in why would you go there and what will you do once you are there. So the nodes are predetermined. What players can do with those nodes is predetermined. But because of PvP, because of player ownership, there is a wide variety of what players can do. And so this exists inside EVE Online today and is a heavy feature of what EVE Online is. The act of transporting resources from one portion of the galaxy to another is something people do, and you have protectors and cargo ships, and it's a whole thing, and you can make a lot of money just moving resources around. So upgrading these things has value, especially as you allow players to have ownership over this. It has value. Now, after we talk about village, we move into towns. This is where things are going to start slowing down, and it's going to take several days to progress to this. And towns are going to have these much bigger buildings. And so we don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but players are going to be able to have medium houses. And after towns are going to come cities. And after cities are going to come metropolises. And metropolises are going to just be ideally massive, hopefully castles, all sorts of ridiculousness. And so you have these lifespans, but what happens when one gets destroyed? Well, players can ideally come in and attack these, and when they destroy them, they're going to trigger an 8th state, a temporary state, a magical state that only exists at that time, and it is temporary. And that is going to be some level of civilization totally on fire. This is going to trigger what World of Warcraft has done through the Gubu Rashi Arena, I think is what it was called, way back in the day. The Guru Bashi Arena. And the Guru Bashi Arena ended up being this temporary kind of PvP zone where everybody could attack everybody. And it resulted in treasure. The goal was to get treasure. And so there will be this PvP event, not unlike a Final Fantasy Fate. Final Fantasy, the game, my primary MMO, has something called Fates, and if I pop out to any zone in the world, there will be actions going on right now. There will be these events that I can take. They're timed, and you get a reward for participating in them. And they have these little icons on them. And those are going on right now. Those happen. And so that will be a fate, a event, and they are random which ones are up, and some can be, it feels like player driven and things like, it doesn't really matter. Some games allow that to be player triggered. Some games mean if you finish one, another one pops, and there's series of them. There's big ones, there's rare ones. Some have fancy rewards, some don't. That's really going to vary by game how you handle that. But basically, there's going to be these events, and these are PvP, and there's going to be treasure that's worth getting. And so if a node gets conquered, it's going to go through this state that allows it to turn into ruins, but that's going to be timed, and then it seems like it's going to go back through the life cycle. But what that ultimately means is that as you progress across all 111 nodes, you're going to be experiencing some version of this in each node. So there's only going to be so much variety. Now, when one node progresses to the next node, there will be beautiful animations of the NPCs building it, but that won't really be something players have control over. It's just an animation. It's just beautiful. So the idea behind this is that it creates a variety in player experience, which it does. It forces you to play differently. And so this is not wildly different than World of Warcraft saying that their mythic key system encourages you to run different dungeons every week because you have different keys. Or Final Fantasy XIV, when you run your dungeons in what they call roulettes, which give rewards, you get a random dungeon from across the list. But anybody who's been in a game that has random long enough learns that the list isn't long enough. The expert roulette, for example, only has 2 dungeons in it, and the level 90 roulette, for example, only has everything that is level 90 that is not in the expert roulette. So it only has 3. So you end up with once you've run it 3, 4, 5 times, once you've been across a couple of zones, once you've played kind of New World or Guild Wars long enough, you realize it all starts to look familiar. And that's where I already start to draw an issue, because it feels like they're thinking that this is going to stop the game from being something that something like YouTube or Twitch or a wiki or a Discord can solve. That they have now somehow outsmarted a community from establishing a meta. That you're going to be able to play your way and you're going to have this crazy variety experience, but you're not. There will absolutely be players that learn how to progress this optimally, and every time you're in a zone, there's going to be an optimized set of tasks you can do if your goal is to send it back down because you're conquering or up because you're growing. There is absolutely going to be an optimal way to play, and players are going to gravitate to that, and they're going to gravitate to the zones that have the most reward. This happens in every game. This is not because of a choice that developers make. Developers make choices that create the tools or the path or the resistance on how players interact. And if they limit interactions that players have fun, players will call that them being fun police. And if they enhance that to the point that it is overly rewarding, players will say that it's too much quality of life and it's making it too easy. And so developers' jobs are to balance that pace, to make sure that we want to have ice cream for dinner, but that we don't eat so much ice cream that we get sick and we can't eat our dinner and feel satisfied with the game, but they don't strip all the ice cream out of the game. That we have an appropriate level of rewards versus grinds. And that's going to vary by player, and it's going to vary who this appeals to. Which is one of the struggles I'm having with Ashes, where it feels like anytime they talk about how good the systems are, they say this is going to take us back to the heyday, the purity of older MMORPGs, back to the Wrath of the Lich King era of games like World of Warcraft, that this is going to take us to that absolute pinnacle, and it's going to be wildly popular because this is something players have wanted, and they're just not being given enough of by the current slate of MMORPGs out there. Now, some of that is by claiming that certain aspects of MMORPGs aren't present in the MMORPG space enough, but that is because they're just looking at the top. So if you search by total active player count, if you search by who has the most marketing materials, who has the most presence on social media platforms, you do see a lack of games that focus on the lack of a trinity. But there are games without a trinity. They exist. They continually get development. They do exist. And so any one element of what they're claiming has been lost to the sands of time is still present in MMORPGs. But they're saying that this infinite number of possibilities is the savior of MMOs, that this is going to bring us back. And that makes it sound like, to people that like this game, it's going to be wildly successful. And they mention times where Wrath of the Lich King had 12 million concurrent players, and that's a sign of that. And so the commercial success is validity. It is a good litmus test to prove that this is good. And so the scorecard will be, don't worry, once people see this, it will be commercially viable. But when anybody comes in and says this will not be commercially viable, they then point out players now are kind of dumbed down by these commercial quality of life games, and that 90% of players are not intelligent enough, not smart enough, not good enough to recognize a good game when it comes out. And so only the true MMOs, those of you that like this game, you're the smart ones. And everybody outside of that, they're mostly just morons. And so the game might not be successful because of the morons out there. There's too many idiots. But don't worry, we don't need a lot of money. We're going to support this game regardless. We don't need a lot of players. This game will be good. It will be good. And it will be good to the people that it appeals to. And we're going to stick to our core values. We're not going to compromise for commercial success, which is easily said when you haven't hit the publish button. And you don't have your core player base, the people who you've shared these experiences with, asking for things. It can be seen as catering to commercial success, but all you're doing is giving players what they asked for. Square Enix came out with Criterion Dungeons, a new hard mode dungeon system. After years of them saying they didn't want to add it to the game, they added it to the game. Now, it's got their own take on it, their own flavor on it. So it's not the Guild Wars Fractal system. It's not the Mutator system out of New World. It's not Mythic Plus. But they added this because it has been being requested by player after player in dev interviews, in Q&As. This has been requested dozens and dozens of times publicly. It's been on the forums hundreds of times. It's been talked about in hundreds of videos, thousands of comments and tweets. This has been something requested for years and years and years and years. And so they gave it to us. Was that them caving? That they wanted to give us a feature that we asked for? And so Ashes has presented this like, we're gonna be pure. We're gonna stick to our Ashes of Creation pillars of design, as they call them. These are what we're gonna stick to. These are our 5 key things. That we are going to create an engaging and immersive story. We're going to create a reactive world. We're going to foster player interaction. We're going to allow for player agency. And we are going to reward the concepts that are present in risk versus reward. And so there is this idea that they are going to stick to this, and that the problem with existing games is that they don't stick to this. The problem with existing games is that they cave and they fall away from this because they just want to appeal to a larger audience. And so Ashes of Creation is going to be a unique take on the MMO. Our world structure is dynamic and built to react to the actions of players. Cities will rise and fall, their populations based on the history of the world as players create it. Quests will unlock as these populations gather. Their needs grow, their secrets are unlocked. As the world's NPC structure is established in real time, players will have the ability to destroy what they've created, paving the way for new development, new populations, and real change. Political strife and intrigue will play a very real role in the structure of your world. Gone are the days of static worlds. Change is here to stay. Okay? Now this sounds really good as a mission statement, but it sounds like what it is saying as the underpinning value is that Ashes of Creation is doing something that no other MMO is doing. That other worlds are not dynamic and do not in any way react to the actions of their players. That content within the game does not become available and not available and change in the way that it is interacted based on the ways that players interact with it. That things that players can do not change based on players' actions. And that the world's predetermined content does not rise and fall based on the way that players do this, allowing players to create real stories that are unique to them. And that there is no intrigue and political and the fostering of stories because your role-playing experience is too curated in other worlds. It sounds like it's saying other games don't do this. Now, I do think that Ashes of Creation is trying to create a unique combination of the things I just listed, but it's not that these things don't exist. So when people say that there is this approximately infinite or procedurally generated, those 111 zones only exist across so many possibilities, and they're only going to have so many quests written in game. And when they say that the primary source of experience within their MMORPG is going to be quests and grinding, you start to say, oh, that sounds a lot like existing MMOs. That doesn't mean they can't be successful. That doesn't mean they can't be successful. New World did not do any one thing that is new in the space. But a lot of the things it did are unique combinations, and a lot of those things are unique combinations for here and now. That some of the things it's done have not been done in a while, or have not been done in quite this combination. But every system within New World is borrowing and learning from other games. And if they're not promising to create a unique structure that is going to change MMOs forever, it doesn't feel like that's their goal. Their goal is to create a fun experience, and if you're having fun, you're doing it right. So it feels like Ashes is trying to redefine all of MMOs, but also make it good. And I think typically those are two separate things in society. Typically there are people on the edge of society, the explorers of the world, the people that venture into new lands. There is usually a lot of hubris, a lot of ego in that, there's a lot of glory in that. But it's typically unsustainable, it causes unforeseen damage, and while they pave the way and they raise the glass ceiling for everybody else, their actual impact is mostly in extending the boundaries of what we thought was possible, in expanding the world that we call the possible world, the lives that we can have. And there are MMOs that do that. But I don't think those MMOs are typically good. I think they just do something that's truly unique. I think the ones that are good are the ones that refine. The reason World of Warcraft had commercial success is not because they invented new content. It's because they took all the other things that other people had tried and tested and said, this is good, this is bad, we're going to combine all the good things and avoid the bad things to the best of our capability, and we're going to make it accessible to the world at large. They were the best at distributing pre-tested ideas. That's what they're doing with Dragonflight. If we go look at Dragonflight features, and we go to something like Wowhead, and we go see what do I need to know about Dragonflight, we can go in here and we can see that there's nothing new in Dragonflight. But it will be commercially successful. It will be. Now, whether or not they support it long-term will determine the active population over a year, and that's just something unique to subscriber-based games, that you're asking somebody for that value proposition every single month. But that will be the very same issue Ashes has. Ashes of Creation is a subscription-based MMO. So Dragonflight has begun, World of Warcraft has begun to tell stories by having a main quest lead you through the zones. A main quest that carries you through the zones and builds on the lore. This is not something that the early expansions of World of Warcraft had, because it's not something that the early expansions of World of Warcraft saw other games doing well. And so they just didn't do that. But in Shadowlands, they did. Now, Guild Wars has this. When you talk about Final Fantasy, this is what they're known for. I played Final Fantasy not for story for years, and people wondered how, because they're known for their story. They're known for this giant, enormous MSQ quest that carries you through the 6 chapters of the original expansion and 4 chapters of each expansion after, and ended with Endwalker, and we will start a new one. So that is Pillar 1. Pillar 1 is an immersive story. So when they say they're gonna have this infinite experience, stories are not infinite. If you want an immersive story in an MMORPG, you either have to have that be single player, so that it is something like a Divinity's Sin or something like that, where you allow people to take the world as far left and as far right as possible. The Guild Wars Tyria story has the ability for the storyline to vary. And you can actually make choices through this where things go left and things go right. But every time you do, they eventually recollapse. And the final event of the story is the same for all players. And you have to do that in any MMORPG where the final fight is something we are all going to fight together. In something like a Choose Your Own Adventure book, or something like Netflix's Bandersnatch, Netflix came out with a show called Bandersnatch, where you could truly feel like your experience was different than everybody else's if you only watched it once. And that is because in Bandersnatch, you got different endings. And so it's yours. So it truly feels infinite. Now, there's only 11 endings, but how you got to your ending and how you felt along the way is yours and yours alone. So it's truly a unique experience. As opposed to... And so you have this unique experience, but MMOs can't do that. And the reason MMOs can't do that is because you have to end up at the same point. You have to end up at the same point. And World of Warcraft has 2 stories, the Alliance one and the Horde one. And even then, both the Alliance and Horde have to make it out alive as factions. So even in expansions where they focus on battling with each other, you'll never defeat the opposing faction. Because there are real players on those factions, and you can't delete their characters. So the outcomes are predetermined. We know that our character survives every single time we go into a fight, because otherwise my character has to be deleted. And so the first pillar of Ashes of Creation is limited by its very nature. So we know that this is limited. Because an engaging and immersive story is already, if it's going to be at this caliber, where they feel that the story is going to be something that is written at a high caliber, that to write at a high caliber, you have to have good writers. You have to have good writers. This cannot be something that is written by a computer. World of Warcraft open world quests could be written by a computer. They absolutely could. You could absolutely, if you wanted to, have the story determine in real time. And Elite Dangerous kind of does this. Elite Dangerous is a single-player-esque version of something like EVE Online. Elite Dangerous is a node-based space exploration game that's absolutely wonderful. I encourage you to play it. And Elite Dangerous allows you to travel through nodes, and there are stories, there are quests that tell you to go and gather and drop stuff off. And so if you go look at the map, it's space, and it's massive. It's massive. There are massive star systems. It takes a long time to explore. And when you look at all these nodes, each of those nodes has factions you can build rep with, and it's all owned by different things. And so it allows for you to travel out to all these different places, and every single place has quests that are unique, has quests that that feel procedurally generated. And I say that in both a good and a bad way, because ultimately, they're not good quests, they're just unique quests. That you've never been in exactly this place, being exactly asked to do exactly this thing for exactly this group of people on behalf of this exact person in exactly this way. But it's not engaging or immersive, it's just large. And so when Steven says in one of his announcements that they're gonna have more story than other games, the way to do that, to have more story than something like Elite Dangerous or more story than something like World of Warcraft, would be to lower the quality so that a large group of writers or a computer-augmented group of writers could plug out story, could create a wide range of possibilities, and could basically Mad Libs this. Mad Libs is basically where you can print this out and you come up with a set of write a noun, write a favorite day of the week, and this will allow you to get something unique. And so on today's date, please excuse this NPC who is far too insert an adjective to be able to slay 10 bear livers, and you could create unique quests. But they're not going to be engaging. There's just going to be a lot of them. So the amount of content cannot be procedurally generated, cannot be approaching infinite, and be engaging and immersive. It either has to be something that they've spent a lot of time developing, in which case there will not be enough of it on launch. One of the largest complaints about New World out of launch was that there was not enough content, because people were comparing it to games that have 9 and 10 years of backlog. They pick up Final Fantasy, and they buy Endwalker, and they're like, oh my god, I had 500 hours of story. But you didn't get 500 hours of story with Endwalker. Players who have been current the whole time are in many cases like, man, I'm kind of bored with Endwalker in some cases. It cannot be engaging, and there be that much of it. Because if you write a lot of it, you have to lower the quality to get it out on time. This is a game that will release sometime in the next decade. I believe that, and I want to play it. But it cannot be engaging in every single quest. Now, you could pick and choose. That's what Dragonflight will do. Dragonflight will have a main scenario quest that will carry you through the zones, and then in addition to that, it'll have, 20, 50, 100 other quests in each zone. That'll be go collect 10 bear livers, go defend the point against 20 orcs, whatever. And it'll allow you to just kind of... Those are just filler quests. Final Fantasy had a lot of these in their early expansions. They've got more and more immersive on a wider scale as they've moved into later expansions, where the stories are a lot better in the side quests in Endwalker. But even in Endwalker, occasionally you realize, oh, that was just kill 10 things. That was just kill 10 things. But Steven has continued presenting that this will feel like an enormous game on day one, which I think is a mistake on his part. And that's where I continue hearing this idea that the game is going to feel infinite and large on day one, and I feel like people are setting themselves up for expectations that they're going to be satisfied on day one. And for a subscription-based game, he's going to have to establish that value very early on. But there are going to be people that are 1 month in, 2 months in, 3 months in, and they are already going to be fatigued with what is available on launch and are going to be expecting something new. And I don't know how fast the Ashes of Creation team will be able to reliably put out new content while continuing to fix bugs with the existing content. They've said the answer is they're just not going to have bugs with it. They're going to have a smooth game on launch. I don't know why he said that. Don't say that. That's a terrible thing to say. And so, when I keep hearing the community use words like infinite possibilities and procedural, those are not Steven's words. Steven did not say infinite. Steven, I have not heard him use the word procedural. But players keep hearing those words. And perception is reality. So if his amount of hype, the amount of hype he's generating, and all he has done is stoke the fires of hype, is allowing players to use words like procedural, we are very much looking at a No Man's Sky type situation. Now, I have not watched all of his announcements, so maybe they're getting that word because he did use it. Maybe. Maybe he used it at some point, but as I've started to watch more and more of his announcements, I haven't heard him use that word. So if he is using it, he's not using it every time. But I am hearing the community more and more and come in and tell me that things are procedural. But then he uses that a core design philosophy, let's assume these are not in order, so let's ignore that this is number one, is that it's going to be engaging and immersive. And I have never seen anything procedurally generated that can be both engaging and immersive. Engaging and immersive has historically always required something about it to be curated. Something about it has to be governed, or you need to be okay with times where large amounts of it are crap. There are games that focus solely on engagement and immersive, so if we remove ourselves from MMORPGs, this becomes a possibility. If you start to move yourself into something like Dwarf Fortress, where the number of procedurally generated things becomes effectively infinite. Effectively. No Man's Sky, for example, does not have an infinite number of worlds. But to say it has an infinite is fair. Because there's like 18 quintillion worlds. Number of worlds in No Man's Sky. And so you cannot visit them all. You cannot. You cannot survive. Like, you will die. If you somehow land, take off, and get to the next world in 1 second, every second from the moment you're born to the moment you die, you cannot get there. So this is infinite. In my opinion, infinite is a fair word to describe this to an individual player, because no individual player will ever land on all of these. We are getting to a point in computing where we are starting to generate resolutions on screen and frame rates on screen that go beyond what humans can perceive. Which means that as far as human perception is concerned, they're perfect. Now, there are reasons that frame rate needs to keep advancing. There are reasons that resolutions need to keep advancing. But as far as any individual one person's perception in any individual one moment, they're solved. They're solved. So can he have procedural feel as infinite as people are implying? Can he have procedural feel as much variety where it's going to redefine it? Yes. But how is he going to make it engaging and immersive? How is he going to make it something where I don't feel that I'm being told to collect 10 bear livers, and now I'm being told to collect 10 deer livers, and now I'm being told to collect 10 rabbit livers, and it's like, oh, so it's just pretty much the same thing then, right? I took off my watch, so now I can't tell time, except that I carry my phone, so it's pretty much the same thing then. That's not engaging or immersive, that's just large. Because the moment you make this an MMO, there have to be restrictions. Because you cannot have me have scalable quests where all of us get to go kill a king and that king stays dead. Because the moment one of us kills the king, that king needs to be dead for everybody else. In a single player game, it's no big deal. In a single player game, you can absolutely kill off NPCs and they can remain dead, and you can have the world just deal with that. In single-player games, you can absolutely have playthroughs have meaningful choices. My brother has played through Cyberpunk a dozen times, and every time he plays with a little bit different build, he plays in a little bit different way, and he says that to him, it is a totally different experience every time. But that's because it's not a shared world, where you have to have shared states. And so his example, the example that keeps getting brought up anytime that procedural gets referenced, is these nodes. And these nodes have ultimately 7 possibilities. And yes, you can argue, well, those possibilities are overlaid by the fact that some have different types of merchants. But all that's going to teach you is, oh, well, these are going to send me on go kill quests, and these are going to send me on trade quests. Because I'm talking to guards and I'm talking to merchants. It's not going to feel immersive or engaging after you've gone to your 100th village that has the same guard saying he used to be an adventurer once till he took an arrow in the knee.